Good morning. We're working with the Gospel of Thomas. We're on the third week of doing that, and so let me just backfill a little bit for those of you who might not have been here. This text was found in 1945 in a cave in Egypt, and it was found by a couple of brothers who were looking for soil to fill their garden with. They were digging in a cave, and they came upon a 3-foot tall copper pot. They thought maybe there might be a genie in there, so they weren't sure if they really wanted to open it or not, but they were hoping it would be gold, and so they cracked it open, and out came these books. And the books and some papers, and they took it home, and they put it by their mother's fireplace, and she promptly burned some of the findings there, along with the straw that she was making a fire with. Now, curiously, these brothers were intent on revenging their father's murder, and they were going to kill the murderer, and they knew they were going to do it soon, so they thought their house might be investigated, so they decided they would get rid of some of these texts rather than just leave them around the house, which turned out to be a good thing for the history of the world. But not so good for the guy that they were after. They did kill him and eat his heart, but just a little something to keep you interested in my talk here. But the books made it their way to a priest, and the priest made it way to somebody in antiquities, and so it eventually got into the mainstream, and we have these books today. What is unusual about these books, and the reason why they were hidden, was that these books are Gnostic text, and the Gnosticism was out of favor with the Orthodox Church, the small c Catholic Church of the day. And so at some point they were just not going to be any of them if somebody didn't hide them, and so they did. So Gnosticism as a strong movement around 80 AD to 200 AD. And then Constantine becomes the emperor of the Roman world and adopts Christianity as his religion around 300 AD. And after that time, it becomes more singular in its shape. Christianity that becomes more singular in its shape and stays more singular in its shape until the Reformation. But in the beginning, there was lots of different Christianities out there, and Gnosticism was a strong one. And Gnosticism essentially is what I would call a perennial wisdom, a wisdom that comes up over and over throughout different parts of the world at different times. And it very much resembles Eastern philosophy, because it basically is talking about coming to know God from within. And we know God best when we know ourselves, that we actually find the clearest experience of the divine by turning inward and feeling into our own nature. So as a thought experiment, I would like you to join me in becoming Gnostics for the day. So here's how it works. I would like you to imagine that you're enlightened right now, not in the future, not like anybody else, but you are enlightened in your own way, perfectly enlightened. Now, we did this yesterday in my class, the class on the 5 principles, and I promise you that everybody there was enlightened for at least 4 hours. Wouldn't you say, those of you who were there, didn't you feel like, couldn't you just tell that you were of another ilk than you had been? Well, you think about it, it's really not that far off. Many of the people who are enlightened say that you have always been enlightened. You've just refused to notice it. So what if you imagined it, you begin to chip away in a very pleasant way that barrier between you and the experience of the enlightenment. And when enlightenment comes, is it coming? Can you feel it? I mean, no, seriously, I'm not kidding. Can you feel that there's a shift in you when you choose to imagine that you're enlightened? I mean, I personally think there's at least equal truth that you've been practicing being unenlightened your whole life. that that's what you've been working on so that you can have a profoundly distant experience from your true nature. And you've had it. And many of us have had it with having it. And we want to be done with that. We want to have the experience of remembering who we really are. And so why not just jump over it? One of my favorite fairy tales is about a guy whose father was a king of the kingdom. The whole kingdom was suffering because this man was wounded, and because the king was wounded, the plants were not flourishing, and there was growing hunger and desperation in the kingdom. And so the oldest brother says, "Don't worry, I hear there's a healing waters just outside the kingdom. I will go there." And the father says, "Yes, but there's a dragon blocking the way." He goes, "Don't worry, I got this." He charges out, and when he finally gets there to the dragon, he sees the dragon and he's frightened and runs back. And the second son does the same thing as well. "I can top my brother." He goes out, fails. The third son, Petru, has a magic horse. He's not very strong, but he is brave. And he says to his father, "I will get your waters." And so he goes out to kill the dragon. And he's on this magic horse who can talk as well as fly. And the horse says to him, "Petru, I'm not so sure about this dragon thing." And Petru says, "No, we're going to defeat the dragon." And they go charging toward the dragon. And just as they get to the dragon, the horse leaps and flies over the dragon, lands on the other side. He gets the magic waters and comes back. Petru says to the horse, though, "Hey, I wanted to kill that dragon." And the horse says, "Some things you kill, some things you just jump over." I think imagination can carry you over the dragon of your own being, where you have practiced being unenlightened long enough. The dragon of mundane life can be defeated not by the sword, but by jumping over it with imagination. So let's imagine that we are enlightened. So if you're imagining you're enlightened, you're on your way to being a good Gnostic, because a Gnostic believes that the fastest way to find God is to look within. This is a little bit different than the Orthodox Church, which is probably why they didn't get along. The Orthodox Church said only through the church can you be saved, but on the other hand, the Gnostic is saying, no, I think really if you want to find God, you look within. And so we have this story in Gnosticism. Is a myth that they came up with to describe how they imagine that the world was created. And since they recognize that the world has troubles in it, and some of the troubles are so fundamental they cannot be overlooked, they cannot be denied, essentially the trouble is this, is that life feeds on life. Every form of life is feeding on, well, almost every form of life is feeding on life itself. So if you're a carnivore, you get that right away. If you're a vegetarian, you think you're getting above it. And if you're a vegan, you go, well, I'm not so sure about me. But yes, indeed, you eat plants. I mean, somebody's eating somebody all the time. And this is fundamental to the nature of the world here. So they said there's something wrong with this, that it should be this way. And they couldn't imagine that a God that was good and perfect would make a world like this. And so they said, here's how it worked. There was a God that was good and perfect, and he emanated big spiritual beings, and those spiritual beings were called demiurges, or half-gods, and they thought they were so cool, and they emanated the world. And so the demiurges are not as good as the good God. They're not perfect. They're demi, half good. And so they make a world that's half good. That's what we live in. And so it's a good story. Fairly well describes the world. And so, but they said that, so within each person, you have the part that's created by the demiurge, but you still have the remnant of the divine, the high God that comes through all the way to you. Passes through the demiurges right into you. And if you really want to know who you really are at depth, then look within. So now reading the fourth one of the sayings, it kind of comes back to something Jesus said, be ye as a child if you wish to enter the kingdom of heaven. And Yeshua said, an aged person will not hesitate to ask a 7-year-old infant about the place of life, and that person will live. Many of the first will make themselves last, and they will become one. So there's a story that I'd heard many times, and probably some of you have heard it as well. There's a 5-year-old girl who comes up to her newborn sister, comes up to the crib, and the parents sneak up to the door because they think it's so cute that she wants to go in and see the baby. And as they're sitting at the door, they hear the 5-year-old say to the baby, "Tell me about God. I'm beginning to forget." And so this backtrack, the divine demiurge, you, this backtracking up, we go back to remember who we are at the beginning. This remembering who we are. So this awakening, this enlightenment that we're working on is really something that has always been here. We have just cascaded down into the present moment. And if we stay in this world and get completely consumed by it, we will forget completely who we are, who we really are. And like the 5-year-old, we may have forgotten even to ask that we remember. We could just forget. Now, a way of remembering is to imagine. I don't know if you know this, but most memory is not accurate, and the reason it's not accurate is every time you remember something, you add imagination to it, and the imagination then becomes the memory, right? This is a well-known fact. It is the truth. So if you've remembered a lot of stuff from your childhood, you probably don't really remember your childhood. You remember your imagined experience. So essentially, we are just made up. We're just making it up. And we're making up that we don't remember who we really are. We go, I don't recognize myself as a divine being. I don't recognize myself as holy or having the force of the universe flowing through me. I don't get that. Yeah, of course you don't, because you made up this story over and over and over to the point where you don't really remember or imagine really who you really are. So why not jump over it? Become the imagination of being an enlightened being. We don't have time for you to go through 100 lifetimes. The world needs you to be awakened now. Now. Think if the world, John Lennon said it, imagine a world where people are peaceful. Imagine a world where people recognize each other as themselves. So now as you're imagining being awakened, do you not find that your peripheral vision gets wider? That you begin to sense the fuller spectrum of all that's coming into your eyes. It's out here, you're there. And in essence, as you begin to widen, your narrowness of your definition of yourself begins to widen out too, and you begin to lose this tight, puckered expression of who you are. You begin to open up, right? See, it's all big enough. We're big enough to handle even a little phone call, right? It doesn't matter. It's just open to all that is. And then you begin, as you begin to imagine you're awakened, alive as the Spirit itself, as you begin to experience that, then the whole world comes from being out there to being in here. You with me? If you are, you can nod. If you don't, you can shake your head. Or you could just be asleep and I wouldn't know which one you're doing, right? Open, wider, wider. Now we have a guy come in, Richard Lang, at the middle of the month of March, and he's going to help us with this. He uses a lot of visual tricks to get your mind to expand into you not being here as a singular, separate being. It's really helpful if you're interested in that. But this idea that you could imagine being awake right now, and that you would, your next breath, you're breathing in the world and you're breathing out the world. You've ceased to be this tight little puckered prune of a person, and you begin to be the full plum of who you really are, right? You open up. We don't need to be this small. We don't need to be as small as we've practiced. We don't need to be as afraid. We don't need to be as discourteous. We don't need to be as self-protective as we have thought, because we are actually that. We are that thing which we're looking for. And the idea of studying the Gospel of Thomas is to have these little hints to remind you, look to see who you really are. Now, part of the looking, when I talk about it, it sounds very thought process oriented, but it can also be from the heart. That essentially you look with your heart, you open your heart, you begin to open, as you open your heart, you begin to open to the all that is. And the whole world can then fall inside your heart. And it can be inside you. And the suffering of others are inside you. And your love for others flows in and out like the tides. And you're just there. And you're that being. You are now moving from being small to being the loving presence in the world. Right? And you don't have to wait a lifetime to do that, or 10 lifetimes, or 1,000 lifetimes, or whatever the Buddha thought he had to take. I read this story recently. I thought it was very cute. So this woman is talking with her Zen teacher, and is asking the Zen teacher, says, I'm really having a hard time. I've got all these worldly responsibilities. I don't know how I can do my practice enough to fully become awakened. I don't have time. And the Zen teacher, sipping her tea with all the compassion in the world, said to her, I hear you. What makes you think you have to leave the world to awaken? And she said, well, Buddha left his family, left the kingdom, left being a prince, and went off to be an ascetic, and that's how he awakened. She said, yes, he did. He left. But you see, when he left, he wasn't awakened. Let's just wake up right here, in our house, in our job, with our family, with the body we have, this time, this lifetime. Practice it. Practice being awake. What the heck? No one can know. You could drive your car and no one knows you're awake. You're fully awake. No one knows. They might flip you the bird, but you're perfectly awake. So I guess I got that. Yes, my son. You always do your fingers like this when instead of the other way. Yes, my son. Just like Jesus did, This is our chance, this lifetime. Lynn Twist said, this generation has the chance to be the most expansive generation of any generation in the history of the world. And it's true. You have a house that's heated. Probably you have a house that's heated. Many of us do. Many of us have a car, so we don't have to walk. Most of us have clothes. Food, we got that. All the things that used to take up everybody's time, we got that. Right? Let's then now be awakened. Your turn. You've made it through 100 generations of being a human being. It's time for us to just let this one be the one. You are called, you are chosen, you have knocked, it's open now. Imagine being awake. And don't forget. Let us pray. So there's several ways to awaken, and one of them is through the heart. So let's go to the heart, so that we don't become fragile in our awakening. Let's move into the heart. Breathe into the heart. Feel into the heart. Think from the heart. And now expand the heart and connect with the full universe. Imagine the universe breathes with every breath you breathe, that you are breathing the universe. And draw all of it inside your heart. And while it's in there, love it, just as it is. Remember, you'll know your nature by returning to the heart. Biblically, you'll know your name by returning to the heart. So be the Christ of your own heart. And so it is.